You want to know what real power looks like when it crumbles? Not the slow fade of empires or the quiet surrender of old men on their deathbeds. Real power dies in a single moment. One decision, one word, one choice that burns everything you've built down to ash. And the worst part? You don't even see it coming. You stand there in your tailored suits and ancestral estates, convinced the world bends to your will, right up until the moment it snaps you in half instead. That's what happened to Duke Adrian Blackthorne of Ravenshire in the winter of 1814. War hero, political giant, the kind of man other men envied and women fantasized about. He had everything: title, fortune, a bride who actually loved him, and he torched it all for a lie wrapped in silk and perfume. But here's what nobody tells you about watching powerful men fall. It's not tragic, it's inevitable. And if you stay with me until the end of this story, you'll see exactly why some men deserve every ounce of pain waiting for them in the dark. Because karma doesn't forget. It just takes its time. The Duke of Ravenshire didn't believe in regret. That's what he told himself every morning, while his valet dressed him in clothes worth more than most families earned in a year. Regret was for weak men, men who second-guessed their decisions, men who lacked the spine to own their choices. Adrian Blackthorne owned everything he'd ever done, every battlefield he'd dominated, every political rival he'd destroyed, every woman he'd seduced and discarded. At 32, he stood at the peak of English aristocracy with the kind of confidence that came from never having truly lost anything that mattered. The morning light cut through the windows of his London townhouse like blades, illuminating the wreckage of last night's excess. Empty wine bottles, scattered playing cards, the faint scent of expensive cigars and cheaper perfume. Adrian stood before the mirror in his dressing room, studying his reflection with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting a weapon. Dark hair perfectly styled, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, eyes the color of winter storms, cold, beautiful, merciless. His valet, Morrison, worked in practiced silence, fastening the buttons of Adrian's waistcoat with fingers that never trembled despite being 70 if he was a day. The old man had served 3 generations of Blackthornes and had long since learned that morning conversation was unwelcome. Perfect, Adrian thought, adjusting his cravat. Because perfection was the baseline, not the goal. The goal was dominance. The door burst open without warning. Adrian didn't flinch. He'd been expecting this particular interruption. Lord Edmund Hartley stood in the doorway, his face flushed red with what Adrian assumed was either rage or too much brandy from the night before. Probably both. Edmund was his closest friend, or whatever passed for friendship among men who viewed relationships as strategic alliances. They'd fought together in the peninsula, saved each other's lives more times than either cared to count, and shared enough secrets to mutually assure destruction if either ever turned. "You're a goddamn fool," Edmund said flatly. Adrian smiled. "Good morning to you too. Coffee?" "I'm serious, Adrian." Edmund crossed the room, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the imported carpet. Morrison made a small sound of distress, but said nothing. "The whole city is talking. You embarrassed Eleanor Whitmore in front of 500 people at Carlton House last night. Her father is a marquis. You don't humiliate men like that and walk away clean." "I ended an engagement," Adrian said, turning back to the mirror. "Hardly a capital offense." "You ended it by announcing your obsession with another woman, in public, during the Prince Regent's ball." Edmund grabbed Adrian's shoulder, forcing him to turn around. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Adrian met his friend's eyes without blinking. "I was honest. Would you prefer I married Eleanor while thinking about Serafina? That seems crueler, don't you think?" "Serafina Vale," Edmund spat the name like poison. "A widow nobody knows anything about except that she showed up from Paris 6 weeks ago with enough money to buy half of Mayfair. You're risking everything for a woman who's probably a French spy. She's intoxicating. She's dangerous. Even better." Edmund released him with a sound of disgust. "You're not thinking with your head." "No," Adrian agreed, his smile sharpening. "I'm thinking with my ambition. Serafina has connections across Europe. She knows people in Vienna, Paris, Berlin, places where real power is being negotiated right now while we're stuck in this ridiculous social theater. Eleanor is lovely, I'll grant you that. Sweet, loyal, boring as death. She'd make a perfect duchess for a man who wants to slowly rot in the countryside surrounded by children and hunting dogs. That's not me. It was never going to be me. Morrison cleared his throat softly. Your Grace, the carriage is ready. Adrian nodded, dismissing the valet with a gesture. Morrison fled gratefully, closing the door behind him. Edmund moved to the window, staring out at the London streets below. Eleanor loved you. Actually loved you, not your title or your money. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Love. Adrian laughed, the sound harsh and empty. Love is what poor people call dependence. Eleanor needed me to validate her existence, to give her purpose beyond embroidery and charity work. I needed someone who could match my ambition, not worship at the altar of it. We were fundamentally incompatible. You're lying to yourself. I'm being realistic. Edmund turned back to face him. I remember Madrid. You took a bayonet through the ribs and nearly died from infection. You were delirious with fever for 3 days, and you know what you kept saying? Her name. Eleanor's name. Over and over. Tell Eleanor I'm sorry. Tell Eleanor I love her. I was there, Adrian. I heard you. Something cold twisted in Adrian's chest, but he crushed it before it could take root. I was dying. Men say stupid things when they're dying. You're still saying stupid things. You're just conscious now. Adrian crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a drink, despite the early hour. The whiskey burned going down, familiar and grounding. Eleanor will survive. Her family has money and connections. She'll marry some gentle, forgettable lord who will treat her like porcelain and bore her to death over breakfast for the next 40 years. She'll be fine. And you? I'll be everything I was always meant to be. Adrian raised his glass in mock salute. Free. Edmund studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, disappointment giving way to something harder, colder. You know what the difference is between us, Adrian? I know I'm a bastard. I own it. But you? You actually believe you're the hero of your own story. That's going to destroy you. Is that a threat? It's a prediction. Edmund headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. When this all falls apart, and it will, don't come looking for sympathy. You're burning bridges you can't rebuild. I don't need bridges, Adrian said. I have wings. Edmund left without another word. Adrian finished his drink in silence, ignoring the faint tremor in his hands. He wasn't nervous. He was excited. Serafina Vale had promised him access to a world beyond England's suffocating social hierarchy. Real power, real influence, the kind that reshaped nations instead of just managing estates. And all it had cost him was one boring engagement to one forgettable woman. Eleanor Whitmore would fade from memory within a month. London society had the attention span of a goldfish. He was sure of it. Wands. The rumors started small, the way poison always does. A week after the public humiliation at Carlton House, Adrian attended a dinner party at Lord Pemberton's estate. The conversation flowed easily at first. Politics, horse racing, the usual aristocratic nonsense. But Adrian noticed the glances, the whispers behind raised hands, the way certain lords found excuses to leave early when he approached. He cornered Edmund near the smoking room. What's going on? Edmund lit a cigar, his expression carefully neutral. You really don't know? Would I be asking if I did? Eleanor hasn't left her family's estate since the ball. Won't see visitors, won't attend events. Her mother told Lady Ashford she hasn't stopped crying. Edmund exhaled smoke. But here's the interesting part. Eleanor hasn't said a single word against you. Not one. While you were busy parading Serafina around like a trophy, Eleanor stayed silent. That silence is making you look worse than any accusation ever could. Adrian felt something ugly coil in his stomach. She's being dramatic. She's being destroyed, and you're the one holding the knife. Edmund's voice dropped. People are taking sides, Adrian, and you might want to consider which side has more swords. I didn't do anything wrong. You shattered a woman's heart in front of the entire aristocracy because you got bored and found a prettier toy. Whether that's technically wrong doesn't matter. It's cruel, and cruelty has consequences, even for dukes. Adrian wanted to argue, but movement near the entrance caught his attention. Serafina had arrived, draped in emerald silk that clung to her curves like sin itself. Every man in the room turned to look. Every woman tensed with jealousy or disgust. Serafina smiled at Adrian across the crowded parlor, and every thought of Eleanor evaporated like morning mist. "Excuse me," Adrian said, already moving toward her. Edmund grabbed his arm. "Be careful with that one. I've been asking around about her. Nobody knows where her money actually comes from. Her husband died in Paris, supposedly, but there's no record of the marriage or his death. She's a ghost, Adrian. Pretty and charming and completely unverifiable. Maybe she values privacy. Or maybe she's hiding something." Edmund released him. "Your funeral. Yes, sant." Adrian crossed the room to Serafina, acutely aware of every eye tracking his movement. She watched him approach with those knowing dark eyes, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Your Grace?" she purred. "You look tense." "Dealing with jealous fools," he said, taking her hand and kissing it. "Nothing I can't handle. I heard about the whispers." She leaned closer, her perfume intoxicating, jasmine and something darker, more dangerous. "Does it bother you that they judge?" "They can judge all they want. I don't answer to them." "Good." Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. "Because men who need approval are boys pretending to be powerful. You're not pretending. Are you, Adrian?" "Never." "Prove it." She pressed something into his palm, a small key on a velvet ribbon. "My townhouse. Midnight. Come alone." Then she was gone, sweeping out of the party as dramatically as she'd entered, leaving Adrian holding the key and ignoring the burning sensation in his chest that felt suspiciously like guilt. He crushed that feeling immediately. Guilt was for weak men, and Adrian Blackthorne was not weak. Midnight found Adrian standing outside Serafina's townhouse in Belgrave Square, the key warm in his palm. Rain had started falling, turning London streets into dark mirrors that reflected gaslight in fractured patterns. He should have brought Edmund, should have told someone where he was going, should have questioned why a woman of such supposed wealth and status would need secrecy. He unlocked the door anyway. The interior was darkness broken by candlelight, dozens of candles scattered throughout the entrance hall, creating shadows that moved like living things. Serafina appeared from the darkness wearing a crimson dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I'm here." "Close the door." He did. She moved closer, circling him like a predator studying prey. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Adrian Blackthorne?" "What?" "A man trapped in a cage he doesn't even realize he's built." Her fingers trailed across his shoulders. "All that power, all that ambition, and you've chained yourself to a system that will never let you be truly great. The aristocracy, the rules, the expectations. They're all designed to keep you contained, manageable. I'm nobody's trained dog." "No?" She stopped in front of him, tilting her head. "Then why were you going to marry Eleanor Whitmore? Sweet, simple Eleanor who wanted nothing more than to be your perfect duchess. Pop out your perfect heirs and watch you slowly transform into your father. Is that what you want? To die having accomplished nothing but maintaining the status quo? What do you want, Serafina?" "I want to show you what real power looks like." She took his hand, leading him deeper into the townhouse. "The world is changing, Adrian. Napoleon may be defeated, but his ideas survive. Democracy, meritocracy. The death of inherited privilege. England can either adapt or be swept away. Men like you, actually talented, actually brilliant, could lead that transformation. But not while you're playing by old rules." They entered a study lined with maps and documents. Adrian recognized military positions, political boundaries, trade routes. This wasn't decoration, this was intelligence. "Where did you get all this?" he demanded. "I have friends in useful places." Serafina poured 2 glasses of wine, handing him one. "Friends who see the future coming and want to be on the right side of it. They've asked about you specifically." "Me? Why?" "Because you're a war hero with political connections and the kind of charisma that makes men follow you into hell. You're exactly the kind of figurehead a new movement needs." She raised her glass. "To revolution." Adrian should have left. Every instinct screamed danger, but the wine was in his hand, her eyes were on his, and the promise of significance, real, lasting significance beyond mere inherited titles, was intoxicating. He drank. "What do I have to do?" he asked. Serafina smiled, and something in that smile should have terrified him. "Just keep being yourself. Attend the right parties. Have conversations with the right people. And occasionally..." She produced a document from her desk. "Share certain information. Nothing treasonous, just details about troop movements, political appointments, things you'd hear anyway at your clubs. Small things." Adrian took the document. It was a request for information about naval positions in the Mediterranean. Harmless, probably. Strategic, definitely. "Who am I sharing this with? Does it matter?" Serafina moved behind him, her hands on his shoulders, her lips near his ear. "You want to change the world, don't you? You want to be remembered as more than just another duke who lived and died and left nothing but portraits? This is how legends are born, Adrian. Not through following rules, but through breaking them." He looked at the document again. Thought of Eleanor crying somewhere in the countryside. Thought of Edmund's warning about bridges burning. Thought of his father, dead 10 years now, who'd spent his whole life doing exactly what was expected, and been forgotten within a month of his funeral. Adrian signed the document. "Good," Serafina whispered, and her kiss tasted like victory and ashes. 3 weeks later, Adrian sat in his study reading reports of French agents arrested in Dover. They'd been carrying forged documents and maps that matched information he'd given Serafina. Information she'd promised was for legitimate political purposes. His hands shook as he read the details. 2 British soldiers had died intercepting the agents. 2 men with families, dead. Because Adrian had been seduced by pretty words and prettier lies. Edmund burst into the study without knocking. "Tell me you didn't." Adrian looked up, his face carefully blank. "Didn't what?" "Don't play stupid. Military intelligence has been tracking a leak for months. Information being sold to French sympathizers, Napoleon loyalists trying to destabilize the new peace, and every piece of leaked intelligence traces back to social circles you frequent, parties Serafina Vale organizes." Edmund slammed his hands on the desk. "Tell me you didn't give that woman classified information." "It wasn't classified." "Bullshit!" Edmund's roar echoed through the townhouse. 2 soldiers are dead, Adrian. Dead because someone told the French where our patrols would be." Adrian stood, ice flooding his veins. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Edmund's face was purple with rage. "You were so goddamn obsessed with feeling important, with playing at Revolution like some university student with daddy issues, that you committed treason, actual hanging offense treason. It was just troop movements, strategic discussions. That got British soldiers killed." Edmund's voice cracked. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any conception of the consequences?" Adrian's mind raced. "We can fix this. I'll go to military intelligence, explain that I was deceived. Upset." "By whom? A woman nobody can verify exists? They'll hang you, Adrian. They'll strip your title, seize your estates, and hang you in front of a cheering crowd. And honestly," Edmund's eyes were dead, "you deserve it." The words hit like physical blows. "There has to be a way," Adrian said, hating the desperation in his voice. "I have connections, political allies, who are currently distancing themselves as fast as humanly possible." Edmund pulled out a letter, throwing it on the desk. "Lord Pemberton, Lord Ashford, the Duke of Wellington himself. They're all cutting ties, Adrian. You're toxic. The only reason you're not already in irons is that military intelligence is trying to trace the leak all the way up the chain before they start making arrests. You have maybe a week before this explodes." Adrian collapsed into his chair. "What do I do?" "You pray." Edmund turned to leave, then paused. "Actually, there might be one person who could help you. Someone with enough political capital and family connections to maybe, possibly, keep you from the gallows." "Who?" "Eleanor Whitmore's father, the Marquis of Ashford." Edmund's laugh was bitter. "The man whose daughter you publicly humiliated has the kind of reach that could bury this. Or bury you. Depends on how merciful he's feeling." But He'll never help me. Not after what I did to Eleanor. Probably not. Edmund opened the door. But he's your only shot. Good luck begging. He left. Adrian sat alone in his study as dawn broke over London, finally understanding that Edmund had been right all along. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was the villain, and villains didn't get happy endings. The Marquis of Ashford kept Adrian waiting for 4 hours in a parlor designed to make visitors feel small. Adrian used the time to rehearse what he'd say, how he'd grovel, what he could possibly offer that would make a father forgive the man who'd destroyed his daughter. He came up empty. When the Marquis finally entered, Adrian barely recognized him. The man had aged a decade in 3 weeks, gray hair now white, face carved with new lines. Eyes that had once been kind, now hard as frozen earth. "Your Grace," the Marquis said flatly, "I'm told you have something urgent to discuss." Adrian stood. "My lord, I need, if the next words out of your mouth are anything other than an apology for what you did to my daughter, you can leave immediately." Adrian swallowed his pride. "I'm sorry, truly, deeply sorry. What I did was unforgivable." "Yes, it was." The Marquis sat, gesturing for Adrian to do the same. "Eleanor hasn't left her room in weeks. She won't eat, won't sleep. The physician says she's making herself ill from grief. My wife cries herself to sleep every night listening to our daughter weep. So tell me, Your Grace, what could possibly bring you to my door after the devastation you've caused?" Adrian wanted to lie, wanted to pretend this was purely about Eleanor, but the Marquis would see through it immediately. "I'm in trouble," he admitted. "Serious trouble, the kind that ends in executions, and I need help." The Marquis studied him for a long moment. "What did you do?" Adrian told him everything. Serafina, the documents, the dead soldiers, the impending arrest. He left nothing out, watching the Marquis's expression shift from anger to disgust to something that might have been pity. When Adrian finished, the Marquis was silent for several minutes. "You truly are a fool," and he finally said, "I know. You destroyed my daughter's life for a French spy. I know. And now you want me to save yours. I have nowhere else to turn." The Marquis stood, moving to a cabinet and producing a thick folder of papers. He dropped them on the table between them. "Do you know what these are?" the Marquis asked. Adrian shook his head. "Debt notices. Gambling markers. I owe us totaling nearly £80,000. The Marquis's voice was ice. "Your father was a compulsive gambler, Your Grace. By the time he died, he'd mortgaged every property, borrowed against every asset, and sold every investment the Blackthorne family ever had. You inherited nothing but debt and a title. You should have lost everything 10 years ago." Adrian's blood turned to ice water. "But you didn't," the Marquis continued, "because I paid it all, every single pound. I bought your father's debts, consolidated them, and forgave them entirely. Do you know why?" "No," Adrian whispered. "Because Eleanor loved you. She begged me to help the man she was going to marry, the man she believed would give her a life of love and partnership. So I saved you. I saved your estates, your reputation, your entire future. Not for you, for her." Adrian couldn't breathe. "Eleanor never knew," the Marquis said. "I never told her because I didn't want her to think you were marrying her out of obligation. I wanted her to believe you loved her freely. What a fool I was." "My lord, be quiet." The Marquis's voice could have frozen fire. "I'm going to tell you something, Your Grace, and you're going to listen very carefully. I can save you from this treason scandal. I have the political connections. I can make witnesses disappear, bury documents, ensure that the investigation points anywhere but at you. I can do all of this." Hope flickered in Adrian's chest. "But I won't." The hope died. "My daughter gave you everything," the Marquis said. "Her love, her loyalty, her entire future. And you repaid that by humiliating her in the cruelest way imaginable. Then you nearly committed treason out of vanity and lust. You deserve everything that's coming for you. Please." However, the Marquis held up a hand. "There is one way I would consider helping you. Anything. Marry Eleanor." Adrian's mind went blank. "What?" "Marry my daughter. Publicly apologize for your temporary madness. Blame it on war trauma if you must, and commit to being the husband she deserves. Do that, and I'll make your legal troubles vanish. Refuse, and I'll personally ensure you hang. Adrian stared at him. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life. The Marquis leaned forward. Eleanor is ruined, Your Grace. Thanks to you, she's now the abandoned bride, a social pariah. No decent man will marry her. She'll spend the rest of her life as a spinster, pitied and mocked, unless you fix what you broke. She'll never agree to it. She will if I ask her to, because she's dutiful and loving and everything you never deserved. The Marquis's eyes glittered. So what will it be? Marriage or execution? Adrian wanted to refuse, wanted to tell this man he couldn't be blackmailed, that he'd face the consequences of his actions like a man. But the thought of the rope, the crowd, the shame, I'll marry her, he whispered. Good. The Marquis stood. The wedding will be in 3 weeks. I suggest you spend that time figuring out how to be worthy of my daughter, because if you ever hurt her again... His smile was colder than winter death. Legal consequences will be the least of your worries. The Marquis left. Adrian sat alone in the parlor, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd lost and what he'd become. He'd traded real love for false passion. He'd traded integrity for ambition. He traded everything that mattered for nothing that lasted. And now he was trapped in a cage of his own making, bound to marry a woman who would spend the rest of her life hating him, a woman he'd once loved and stupidly thrown away. Outside, thunder rumbled. The storm was just beginning, but somewhere in a distant room, Eleanor Whitmore sat by a window, watching rain fall on English gardens, unaware that her father had just sold her future to save the man who'd already destroyed her heart once before. And the letter she'd been writing, the one to Viscount Julian Mercer, accepting his quiet proposal of marriage and his promise of a life far from London's cruelty, lay unfinished on her desk, about to become another dream she'd never be allowed to keep. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Adrian left the Ashford estate. It hammered against the carriage roof like accusation, each drop a reminder of how thoroughly he'd destroyed his own life. His clothes were soaked, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. And somewhere behind those stone walls, Eleanor Whitmore, the woman he'd publicly humiliated, the woman whose family had secretly saved him from ruin, was about to have her entire future decided without her consent, just like he'd decided it 3 weeks ago when he ended their engagement. The symmetry would have been poetic if it wasn't so goddamn cruel. Adrian pressed his forehead against the cold window glass, watching London's streets blur past in the darkness. The Marquis's ultimatum echoed in his skull like a death sentence. Marry Eleanor, or hang. Save your neck by destroying hers all over again. Become the husband she deserves when you've already proven you're incapable of deserving anything. The worst part? He was going to do it, because survival always won over honor when the rope was waiting. That's what separated men who talked about nobility from men who actually faced the consequences of their choices. Talk was cheap. Living was expensive. And Adrian had just sold what remained of his soul for the price of his own skin. The carriage jolted over cobblestones. His stomach lurched with it. He should feel grateful, relieved. The Marquis was offering him an escape from treason charges that should have ended with his corpse swinging in Tyburn. But all Adrian felt was the crushing weight of inevitability. The sensation of walls closing in, options disappearing, freedom dying one decision at a time. This is what you wanted, a voice whispered in the back of his mind. Power without accountability. Pleasure without consequence. You thought you could break the rules and walk away clean. Turns out the rules break you instead. The carriage stopped outside his townhouse. Adrian climbed out into the downpour, too numb to care about the water soaking through his coat. Morrison waited in the doorway with a towel and fresh clothes, his expression carefully neutral in that way servants perfected when their employers were falling apart. Inside, the house felt like a mausoleum. Too quiet. Too empty. Adrian had dismissed most of the staff weeks ago when money got tight, and he was too proud to admit the Blackthorne fortune was a carefully maintained lie. Now the silence pressed against his eardrums like accusation. He found Edmund waiting in his study, sitting in Adrian's chair with his boots on Adrian's desk like he owned the place. A half-empty bottle of Adrian's best whiskey sat beside him. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Finally, Edmund said, You look like death. Feel worse. Adrian stripped off his wet coat, letting it fall to the floor. The Marquis will help. But there's a price. There's always a price. Edmund poured 2 glasses, sliding one across the desk. What does he want? Your estates? Your title? Your firstborn? Eleanor. Edmund's hand froze halfway to his mouth. What? He wants me to marry her. Public apology, grand romantic gesture, the whole performance. Prove I'm worthy of his daughter, or hang for treason. Those are my options. Edmund stared at him. Then he started laughing, a harsh, bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. Oh, that's beautiful. That's absolutely perfect. He's making you live with what you did. Not just apologize, not just feel guilty. Actually marry the woman you destroyed and spend the rest of your life knowing you don't deserve her. It's blackmail. It's justice. Edmund took a long drink. Poetic justice, even. You wanted freedom so badly you torched your engagement. Now you're going to be more trapped than you ever would have been if you just kept your word in the first place. Adrian grabbed the whiskey bottle and drank straight from it. The burn felt good. Real. She'll never agree to it. She will if her father tells her to. Eleanor's dutiful like that. Loyal. Edmund's voice turned sharp. All those qualities you found so boring? Those are the same ones that'll make her go through with this, even though every part of her must want to tell you to burn in hell. I know. Do you? Edmund leaned forward. Because I don't think you actually understand what you're asking of her. You humiliated Eleanor in front of everyone who matters. Made her the joke of London society. And now you're going to force her to stand beside you at an altar and pretend everything's fine? That's not salvation, Adrian. That's torture. I didn't ask for this. Well, you created this. Edmund slammed his glass down hard enough to crack it. Every single part of this nightmare is your fault. Serafina, the treason? The debts you didn't even know existed. All of it traces back to your ego and your goddamn selfish need to feel special. You think I don't know that? Adrian's voice cracked. You think I haven't figured out that I'm the villain here? I destroyed the one woman who actually loved me for a fantasy that never existed. I nearly got British soldiers killed because I was too stupid and vain to see I was being used. I know what I am, Edmund. I know. The words hung in the air between them like gun smoke. Edmund's expression softened slightly. Then why go through with it? Why not just face the consequences like a man? At least you'd die with some dignity intact. Because I'm not brave enough. Adrian collapsed into the chair across from his friend. I'm not noble or heroic or any of the things I pretended to be. I'm a coward who'd rather trap an innocent woman in a loveless marriage than face a rope. That's who I actually am when everything else gets stripped away. Edmund studied him for a long moment. You really loved her, didn't you? Eleanor. I don't know. Adrian's throat felt tight. I thought I did. Then Serafina showed up and made everything with Eleanor feel small and boring by comparison. But maybe that was the point. Maybe real love is supposed to feel steady instead of exciting, safe instead of dangerous. Little late for that revelation. Yeah. Adrian took another drink. Story of my life. They sat in silence as the rain continued its assault on London. Somewhere in the city, Serafina Vale was probably planning her next move, identifying her next target, spinning webs that would trap other stupid men who confuse seduction with significance. And somewhere else, Eleanor Whitmore was crying herself sick over a man who'd never deserved her tears. Edmund finally stood, adjusting his coat. I'll stand with you at the wedding, not because I approve, I don't, but because we're friends, and friends don't abandon each other even when they're being idiots. Thanks. Don't thank me. I'm doing it for her, not you. Eleanor deserves at least one person in that church who's on her side. He left. Adrian sat alone in the growing darkness, too tired to light the lamps, too numb to move. The whiskey bottle was nearly empty. His future was a cage, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear his father's voice, the old duke who'd gambled away everything and left his son nothing but debts and a worthless title, laughing at how the mighty had fallen. Like father, like son. The pattern repeated itself whether you wanted it to or not. 3 days later, Adrian received a letter. It arrived during breakfast, or what passed for breakfast when you'd lost your appetite, and most of your household staff. Morrison brought it on a silver tray with the Morning Post, his face carefully neutral in that way that meant he'd already read it and knew it was bad news. Adrian recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor's. His hand shook as he broke the seal. The letter was short, written in the same elegant script that had once filled love letters and dinner invitations and plans for their future together. Your Grace, my father has informed me of the arrangement. I understand the circumstances that necessitate this marriage, and I will fulfill my duty as required. However, I have conditions that are non-negotiable. We will maintain separate bedrooms. You will not enter mine without explicit invitation. You will attend all social functions required to maintain appearances, but you will not touch me beyond what is socially necessary. You will not take a mistress. If you cannot honor our marriage vows, at least honor the pretense of them. After we produce an heir, we will live separate lives. You may have your estates. I will have mine. These are my terms. Accept them or hang. Eleanor Whitmore. Adrian read it 3 times, feeling something crack in his chest with each pass. The coldness in those words, the clinical detachment. This wasn't the Eleanor who'd once written him letters full of warmth and hope and plans for growing old together. This was someone else, someone he'd created by destroying the original. He thought about the night she'd sat beside his sickbed after Madrid, reading to him, while infection burned through his body. Thought about the way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes, the way her hand felt in his, the quiet moments that had felt like safety in a world built on violence and chaos. All of that was gone now, burned away by his own stupidity. Adrian picked up his pen and wrote a single word on expensive paper. Agreed. He sealed it, gave it to Morrison, and waited for the walls to finish closing in. The announcement appeared in the Times 2 days later. Duke of Ravenshire and Lady Eleanor Whitmore to wed in intimate ceremony following brief postponement due to military obligations. The tone would read between those lines. Everyone knew there had been no military obligations, only public humiliation and scandal, but at least it gave Eleanor's family a face-saving narrative. The gossip exploded anyway. Adrian attended exactly one social function in the week leading up to the wedding, a dinner party at the Duke of Wellington's estate that he couldn't refuse without causing offense. He walked into that dining room knowing every eye would be on him, every whisper dissecting his fall from grace. He wasn't disappointed. Lady Ashford, Eleanor's mother, sat across from him during dinner and didn't speak a single word in his direction. When their eyes met, hers were full of contempt so pure it could have stripped paint. Several other ladies followed her lead, creating a wall of silent judgment that was somehow worse than outright confrontation. The men were more direct. Lord Pemberton cornered him near the port service. Heard you're marrying the Whitmore girl after all. Quite the reversal. Circumstances changed, Adrian said flatly. Indeed. Pemberton's smile didn't reach his eyes. Funny how circumstances change when military intelligence starts asking uncomfortable questions. Word is you had some interesting conversations with certain French sympathizers. Adrian's blood turned to ice. I don't know what you're talking about. Si. Of course you don't. Pemberton took a sip of port. Just as I'm sure the Marquis of Ashford's sudden intervention with said military intelligence is completely unrelated to your upcoming nuptials. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? If you have accusations, make them plainly. I'm not accusing anything, Your Grace. Merely observing that powerful men often escape consequences that would destroy lesser individuals. Pemberton's voice dropped. But here's the thing about escaping consequences. You still have to live with what you did. Every morning when you wake up next to that poor girl, knowing she's only there because her father forced her to save your worthless neck. That's a special kind of hell, isn't it? Adrian wanted to throw his drink in the man's face, wanted to challenge him to a duel, wanted to do anything except stand there and take the verbal beating like a whipped dog. Instead, he said, "Excuse me," and walked away. Because that's what cowards did. They walked away. Edmund found him on the terrace, gripping the stone balustrade hard enough to hurt. You look like you're planning to jump. Considering it. Don't. The fall's not high enough to kill you. You just end up crippled and still facing all the same problems. Edmund lit a cigar, offering Adrian one. Pemberton give you trouble? Everyone's giving me trouble. I'm the villain of the season, the cautionary tale mothers will tell their daughters for the next decade. You earned it. I know I earned it. Adrian spun to face him. Everyone keeps reminding me like I might have forgotten. Trust me, I'm acutely aware of every mistake I've made and exactly how thoroughly I've destroyed my own life. Edmund exhaled smoke into the night air. Eleanor arrived in London this afternoon. Adrian's anger evaporated, replaced by something colder. She's staying with her aunt. Refuses to see you before the wedding. Her mother says she's not eating again. Edmund's jaw tightened. She asked about Serafina. What about her? Wanted to know if you were still seeing her. If this marriage was just another performance while you kept your mistress on the side. Shame burned through Adrian's chest. What did you tell her? Well, I told her the truth. That Serafina disappeared the moment military intelligence started making arrests. Vanished like smoke. No forwarding address, no trace, nothing. The townhouse in Belgrave Square? Rented under a false name, already cleared out. Edmund turned to look at him. You gave classified information to a ghost, Adrian. A beautiful, charming ghost who never existed in the first place. Adrian had already known this, had already processed the full scope of his stupidity, but hearing it said out loud still felt like a knife between the ribs. Did that help? He asked quietly. Knowing Serafina was fake? No. Edmund's voice was hard. Because fake or real, you still chose her over Eleanor. That's the part that actually matters. Eleanor loved you, and you looked at that love and decided it wasn't enough. Nothing's going to erase that. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm rolling in. Adrian watched lightning fork across the sky and thought about all the choices that had led him to this moment. The engagement he'd broken. The woman he'd humiliated. The treason he'd nearly committed. The marriage he was being forced into. Every decision a link in a chain that was slowly strangling him. I dreamed about her last night, Adrian admitted. Eleanor. We were back at the beginning before any of this happened. She was laughing at something I said, and her eyes were full of light, and I remembered thinking, this is what happiness feels like. Not excitement or passion or conquest, just peace. You can't go back, Edmund said. I know. And you can't fix this. I know that too. So what are you going to do? Adrian didn't have an answer. The wedding was in 4 days. His life was no longer his own. The best he could hope for was that Eleanor would eventually stop hating him enough to tolerate his presence. The worst was that she'd spend the next 50 years looking at him with the same contempt her mother showed tonight. Either way, he'd earned it. I'm going to try, Adrian finally said, to be better, to be worthy of her, even if it takes the rest of my life. Edmund stubbed out his cigar. You know what the sad part is? I actually believe you mean that. Right now, in this moment, you genuinely want to change. But wanting isn't the same as doing. And the first time things get difficult, the first time you feel trapped or bored or restless, you're going to fall back into the same patterns. Because that's who you are, Adrian. That's who you've always been. Then I'll change who I am. People don't change. Not really. They just get better at hiding their true nature. Edmund left him alone on the terrace. Adrian stayed there until the storm finally broke, letting the rain soak through his clothes, wondering if Edmund was right. Wondering if he was fundamentally incapable of being the man Eleanor deserved. Wondering if this marriage was just delaying the inevitable, the moment when his true nature reasserted itself and he destroyed her all over again. The rain tasted like failure, and Adrian swallowed every drop. The wedding took place on a gray morning that threatened snow. Not the grand spectacle at St. George's they'd originally planned, but a quiet ceremony in the Ashford family chapel with maybe 30 witnesses. Most of London society had declined their invitations, some out of loyalty to Eleanor, others because associating with Adrian had become socially dangerous. Adrian stood at the altar in his dress uniform, medals polished, every inch the distinguished war hero. The costume didn't fit anymore. He felt like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Edmund stood beside him as best man, his expression unreadable. The chapel doors opened. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and Adrian's breath stopped in his throat. She looked beautiful, devastatingly beautiful. Her wedding dress was simpler than the elaborate gown she'd commissioned for their original ceremony. White silk, without ornamentation, elegant in its restraint. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing the angles of her face. But it was her eyes that destroyed him. Empty. Not angry or sad or hurt, just empty. Like someone had reached inside Eleanor Whitmore and scooped out everything that made her alive, leaving only a perfect shell that knew how to move through the motions of existence without actually feeling any of it. Adrian had done that. He'd killed the light in her eyes as surely as if he'd used a blade. The Marquis placed Eleanor's hand in Adrian's. His grip was iron, his whisper audible only to the three of them. Hurt her again, and I'll destroy you in ways hanging would be mercy by comparison. Then he stepped back. The ceremony began. Adrian heard himself repeating vows he didn't deserve to make, promising to love and cherish a woman he'd already proven he couldn't value properly, swearing to honor someone he'd publicly dishonored. The words were ash in his mouth. Eleanor repeated her own vows in a voice like frost. No tremor, no emotion, just clinical recitation of legally binding words that would chain them together until death. When the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," Adrian hesitated. Eleanor's eyes met his for the first time since entering the chapel. They were the same blue he remembered, but colder now. Arctic cold. And in that cold, Adrian saw his own future reflected back. Years of careful distance, practiced civility, the slow death of any possibility for genuine connection. He leaned in. She didn't pull away. Their lips touched for exactly 1 second. No passion, no warmth, just the mechanical fulfillment of social obligation. The witnesses applauded politely. Adrian tasted like ashes, and Eleanor smelled like resignation. And somewhere in heaven or hell, someone was laughing at how thoroughly he'd destroyed the one good thing in his life. The reception was worse. They stood in the Ashford ballroom receiving congratulations from people who didn't mean them, smiling for appearances while dying inside. Eleanor's hand in his was cold. When they danced the traditional first waltz, she held herself at maximum distance, her eyes fixed somewhere over his shoulder. "Eleanor," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate, but I need you to know. But I don't." Her voice could have frozen fire. "Don't apologize, don't explain, don't try to make this bearable. We're here because you committed treason, and my father chose to save you instead of letting justice take its course. I'm fulfilling my duty. That's all this is. It doesn't have to be, Shet." "Yes, it does." Now she looked at him, and the emptiness in her eyes was worse than any anger could have been. "You killed whatever we had, Adrian. You killed it in front of 500 people at Carlton House when you announced you'd found someone better, someone more exciting, someone worth destroying our future for. She was a lie, but your feelings weren't. You really believed I wasn't enough, that our life together would be boring, that you deserved something more thrilling than the woman who'd spent years loving you." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "So this is what you get instead. A wife who'll smile in public and despise you in private. A marriage that's a legal contract and nothing more. You wanted excitement? Congratulations. You're going to spend the rest of your life knowing you traded happiness for drama and got neither." Take. Bang. The music swelled around them. Adrian tried to find words, any words, that could penetrate the ice. He came up empty. Because Eleanor was right. He'd made his choices. Now he had to live inside the cage those choices had built. When the dance ended, Eleanor immediately left his side to speak with her mother. She didn't return. For the rest of the reception, they existed in separate orbits, performing their roles without ever genuinely connecting. By the time the carriage came to take them to Adrian's estate, their estate now, neither had spoken to the other in hours. The drive through the countryside was silent. Eleanor stared out one window. Adrian stared out the other. Between them sat the weight of everything unsaid, everything destroyed, everything that could never be repaired. When they finally arrived at Blackthorne Hall, Eleanor went straight to her bedroom, the one she'd insisted on in her letter, and locked the door behind her. Adrian stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of her crying through the wood, knowing he'd caused every tear and had no right to comfort her through them. He went to his own room, poured himself a drink, and sat by the window watching moonlight paint the ground silver, thinking about the military reports that would have gotten him hanged, thinking about Serafina's smile and how convincing lies could be when you wanted to believe them, thinking about Eleanor's empty eyes and the particular kind of death that came from killing someone's love while they were still breathing. The house was silent except for distant sobbing. Adrian finished his drink, poured another, and finally understood that Edmund had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't a cage. It was a grave. He'd just been buried alive in it. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, he dug it himself. Somewhere in London, military intelligence officers were closing files marked classified, satisfied that the leak had been identified and neutralized through political channels instead of public execution. Somewhere in Paris or Vienna or Berlin, Serafina Vale was choosing her next target, her next mark, her next stupid, powerful man who'd mistake seduction for significance. Somewhere in England, people were already forgetting about the Duke of Ravenshire's scandal because new gossip always replaced old. But in Blackthorne Hall, in separate bedrooms with locked doors between them, two people who'd once loved each other lay awake in the darkness, each knowing they were trapped in a marriage that was punishment for one and prison for the other. And in the morning, they'd wake up and do it all again, every morning, for the rest of their lives. Because that's what happened when you destroyed something beautiful. You got to live in the ruins forever. 6 weeks of marriage felt like 6 years in hell. Adrian had thought he understood what isolation meant. He'd commanded men in war, watched friends die in foreign mud, spent nights alone in command tents making decisions that would get soldiers killed no matter which choice he made. He thought he knew loneliness. He knew nothing. Loneliness was waking up every morning in a house with the woman you'd once loved and realizing she'd rather die than speak to you. Loneliness was hearing her footsteps in the hallway and watching her change direction to avoid passing your door. Loneliness was sitting across from each other at dinner in complete silence, while servants pretended not to notice the Arctic cold between them. Eleanor had perfected the art of existing in the same space without acknowledging his presence. She was a ghost haunting her own life, moving through Blackthorne Hall like a beautiful corpse performing the motions of living without actually being alive. When social obligations required them to appear together, dinners with neighboring gentry, visits from her family, she transformed into the perfect duchess, smiled at the right moments, laughed at appropriate times, touched his arm with practiced affection that dissolved the instant witnesses left. Then she'd retreat to her locked bedroom, and Adrian would hear her crying through the walls. He stopped trying to apologize after the first week. His words meant nothing. Sorry couldn't resurrect what he'd killed. So he gave her space and tried to figure out how to live in a marriage that was functionally a prison for both of them. The estates needed attention. His father's gambling debts might have been paid, but years of neglect had left Blackthorne properties in varying states of decay. Adrian threw himself into the work, reviewing tenant contracts, inspecting farmland, meeting with stewards who'd been embezzling for years because nobody had been paying attention. It gave him something to do besides contemplate the smoking ruins of his life. That's how he found the first discrepancy. He was reviewing ledgers in the estate office when a number caught his eye. A payment to a London creditor for £10,000, dated 3 months before his father's death. The notation read, "Settlement of honor debt per Lord Ashford's instruction." Adrian stared at it. Then he pulled more ledgers, found more payments, all routed through the Marquis of Ashford, all dated years before Adrian's engagement to Eleanor had even been discussed. His hands started shaking. He spent the next 3 hours tracing every transaction, every debt payment, every mysterious transfer of funds. The pattern emerged like a nightmare taking shape in the darkness. The Marquis of Ashford hadn't just paid off Adrian's father's gambling debts after the engagement. He'd been systematically buying up those debts for nearly a decade, consolidating them, holding them like a weapon waiting for the right moment to use. The engagement to Eleanor hadn't been a love match. It had been a transaction. The Marquis had engineered the entire thing, introducing Eleanor to Adrian at specific social events, ensuring they were seated together at dinners, creating opportunities for romance to develop naturally. And all the while, he'd held Adrian's financial future in his palm like a loaded gun, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. Adrian's stomach turned to ice. He thought about the Marquis's face during their confrontation, the cold satisfaction when he revealed the debt papers, the way he'd framed the marriage ultimatum as saving Adrian from treason when really he was simply collecting on an investment that had taken years to mature. This had never been about protecting Eleanor. It had been about control. Adrian stood up so fast his chair crashed backward. His vision blurred at the edges. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in like the cage he'd finally realized he was trapped inside. He needed air, needed to think, needed to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated by a man he'd trusted to be acting in good faith. He stumbled out of the office and nearly collided with Eleanor in the hallway. She stepped back quickly, her face shuddering closed, but not before Adrian saw something flicker in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or fear. Hard to tell when she'd gotten so good at hiding everything. "Excuse me," she said quietly, moving to go around him. "Wait." The word came out harsher than he intended. "Did you know?" Eleanor froze. "Know what?" "About your father, about the debts, about how long he'd been planning this." Adrian's voice was rising, but he couldn't stop it. "Did you know he'd been buying my father's gambling markers for 10 years? That our entire relationship was engineered from the start?" Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me!" He grabbed her arm, not hard, but firm enough that she couldn't pull away immediately. "I found the ledgers. Your father started buying my family's debt before we even met. He set this whole thing up, the introduction, the courtship, everything. It was a trap, and I walked right into it." Eleanor wrenched her arm free, her eyes blazing with the first real emotion he'd seen from her in weeks. "You think my father orchestrated our relationship? You think I was part of some conspiracy to trap you into marriage? I don't know. Were you?" The slap came fast and hard enough to snap his head sideways. The crack echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. They stared at each other, both breathing hard. Eleanor's hand was still raised, trembling. Her face had gone white except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice shook with barely contained rage. "How dare you? How dare you? You destroyed me in front of everyone who matters. You humiliated me, abandoned me, chose a French spy over me, and then forced me into a marriage I never wanted. And now, you have the audacity to suggest I somehow plotted to trap you? That's not what My father protected you because I begged him to." Eleanor's composure shattered completely. "When your family's debts came to light, when the creditors started circling, I went to him on my knees and pleaded with him to help the man I loved. I didn't know he'd been buying those debts for years. I thought he was doing it as a favor to me, because that's what fathers do. They help their daughters' chosen partners." Adrian felt the ground shifting beneath him. "Eleanor, I loved you." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I loved you so much I convinced my father to save you from financial ruin. I loved you enough to ignore every warning sign that you weren't capable of loving me back the same way. And you repaid that by throwing me away the moment someone more exciting came along." I know I did, but your father... My father gave you a choice." Eleanor's voice cracked. "Marry me or face treason charges. Yes, he manipulated you. Yes, he used his power to force your hand. But you know what? You earned that manipulation. You committed actual treason. You gave military secrets to enemy agents. The fact that my father offered you any escape at all instead of just letting you hang is more mercy than you deserved." "Ah, si, Pornstein." "So you did know." Adrian's voice was hollow. "About the ultimatum, about him forcing this marriage." Eleanor wiped her eyes roughly. "I knew he was protecting you from legal consequences. I didn't know he'd been accumulating your family's debts for a decade. I didn't know any of that until right now." They stood in the hallway, both of them trembling, in the last 6 weeks of carefully maintained distance exploding into raw honesty that hurt worse than silence ever could. "Why didn't you tell me?" Adrian asked quietly. "About your father forcing you to agree to this marriage. Why did you let me think you chose it?" "Because my pride is the only thing I have left." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "You already took my love, my dignity, my future. I wasn't going to hand over my pride too by admitting I was being forced into this just like you were. At least this way I could pretend I had some control over my own life." Adrian sank against the wall. Everything he thought he understood kept shifting, revealing new layers of manipulation and pain underneath. "We're both prisoners." "Yes." "Your father played us both." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was tired now, the anger draining away. He played you by accumulating leverage over years. He played me by raising me to be dutiful and obedient. We're both exactly where he wanted us, trapped in a marriage that serves his political interests while destroying us personally. What do we do, son? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something in her eyes had changed. Not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of understanding that they were both victims of forces larger than their individual failures. I don't know, she admitted. But standing in this hallway screaming at each other probably isn't helping. Despite everything, Adrian felt the corner of his mouth twitch. No, probably not. Eleanor started to turn away, then paused. The debts. The ones my father bought. Do you know where the actual papers are kept? Probably in his estate. Why? Well, because debt papers can be destroyed, and without physical proof of those obligations, his leverage over you disappears. Adrian stared at her. You want to steal from your own father? I want to stop being a chess piece in his political games. Eleanor's jaw set. If we're going to be trapped in this marriage, we should at least be trapped by our own choices instead of his manipulation. Don't you think? For the first time in 6 weeks, Adrian saw a spark of the woman he'd fallen in love with, fierce, intelligent, unwilling to be controlled. That's dangerous, he said. If we're caught, we're already caught. Eleanor met his eyes directly. The question is whether we stay caught or try to break free. Your choice, Your Grace. She walked away before he could answer. Adrian stood in the empty hallway, his cheek still stinging from her slap, his mind racing through possibilities. Eleanor was right. The debt papers were the Marquis's primary weapon. Destroy them, and they'd at least remove one chain from the cage. But breaking into the Ashford estate to steal documents would be incredibly risky. If they failed, if they were discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic. Then again, what did they have to lose that hadn't already been taken? Adrian pushed off the wall and headed for his study. If they were going to do this, they needed a plan. And for the first time since the wedding, he and Eleanor might actually be working toward the same goal instead of suffering in parallel isolation. It wasn't much, but it was something. Edmund arrived 2 days later in response to Adrian's urgent summons. He rode up to Blackthorne Hall looking exhausted and annoyed, dismounting with the stiff movements of someone who'd been traveling too long. This better be important, he said, brushing road dust from his coat. I was in the middle of delicate negotiations with— I need your help stealing from the Marquis of Ashford, Adrian interrupted. Edmund stopped walking. I'm sorry, what? What's all she is was. They moved to Adrian's study, where he laid out everything. The ledgers, the decade-long debt accumulation, the engineered relationship, Eleanor's revelation about being forced into the marriage just like he was. Edmund listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Adrian finished, Edmund poured himself a very large drink. So let me make sure I understand, he said slowly. You want to break into one of the most powerful aristocrats in England's private estate, steal legal documents that could destroy you if their existence became public, and somehow do this without getting caught or killed. Is that accurate? Yes. And Eleanor is part of this plan? It was her idea. Edmund stared at him. The woman who hasn't spoken to you in 6 weeks suddenly wants to commit felony theft with you as her partner in crime? We had a conversation. Things changed. Adrian didn't mention the slap or the screaming. Some details weren't relevant. This is insane. Probably. If you get caught, the Marquis will destroy you both, Eleanor included. I know. You could hang. Again, only this time he won't save you. I know that too. Edmund took a long drink. Why now? Why risk everything when you've already survived the worst of it? You're married. The treason charges are buried. You have your life, your title, your estates. Why not just accept the cage and live in it? Adrian thought about the past 6 weeks. The silence. The distance. The slow death of living with someone who despised you while being legally bound to them forever. He thought about Eleanor's eyes when she realized her father had been manipulating her just as thoroughly as he'd manipulated Adrian. 2 pawns on someone else's chessboard, moving through predetermined patterns without agency or choice. Because I'm tired of being controlled, Adrian said simply. By her father, by social obligation, by consequences of my own stupidity. For once in my life, I want to make a choice that's actually mine instead of just reacting to traps other people have set. Even if it's a stupid choice. Especially because it's a stupid choice. You mean, maybe. Edmund studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed and poured himself another drink. You're going to need inside information, guard schedules, layout of the estate, location of the Marquis's private study. I assume you don't have any of that? Not yet. Of course not, because that would be too easy. Edmund ran a hand through his hair. I might know someone, former employee of the Ashford household. Got dismissed for drinking on duty but wasn't happy about it. Might be willing to talk for the right price. Adrian felt hope flicker in his chest. Can you contact them? Me. I can try, but Adrian... Edmund's expression was serious. If we do this, there's no going back. You'll be burning the last bridge you have with Eleanor's family. The Marquis might be manipulative, but he's also the only reason you're not currently rotting in a military prison. Cross him like this, and he'll come after you with everything he has. Let him. Adrian's voice was harder than he'd heard it in weeks. I'm done being grateful for a cage just because it's better than a noose. Edmund nodded slowly. All right, I'll make contact, but we're going to need Eleanor's help with the actual entry. The guards know her. She can move through that house in ways we can't. I'll talk to her. Good luck with that. Last I heard, she'd rather drink poison than have a conversation with you. Things have changed, Adrian repeated. Edmund looked skeptical but didn't argue. He left that evening to pursue his contacts, promising to return within a week with either information or confirmation that this plan was completely impossible. Adrian spent the time trying to figure out how to approach Eleanor about the actual execution of their theft. They'd agreed on the goal, but agreeing and actually working together were very different things. He found her 3 days later in the conservatory, reading by the afternoon light. She looked up when he entered, her expression carefully neutral. We need to talk, Adrian said. Do we? Edmund is working on getting information about your father's estate. If he succeeds, we'll need to move quickly. That means planning. Together. Eleanor closed her book. And if Edmund can't get the information, then we find another way, or accept that we're stuck in this situation permanently. She stood, moving to the window. You realize this could end very badly, for both of us. I do. My father won't be merciful if he catches us. He'll see it as the ultimate betrayal, his own daughter conspiring against him. I know. Eleanor turned to face him. Then why are you willing to risk it? Adrian chose his words carefully. Because living in a cage you built yourself is one thing. Living in a cage someone else locked you in is another. I made terrible choices that destroyed what we had. I own that. But I'm tired of continuing to be punished through your father's manipulation. If I'm going to suffer, I want it to be consequence of my own decisions, not his. Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Maybe respect, maybe understanding. That's surprisingly honest. I'm trying to be better at that. 6 weeks too late. I know. Adrian moved closer, not touching her, but closing some of the distance that had defined their marriage so far. But if we're going to do this, if we're going to actually try to break free, we need to be able to work together. That doesn't mean forgiving me. You don't owe me that. But it means being honest about what we both want and figuring out how to get it. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. What do you want, Adrian? Really want, underneath all the guilt and regret. He thought about it. Really thought instead of just reacting. I want to stop feeling like a puppet. I want to make decisions that are actually mine. And I want... He hesitated. I want the chance to prove I can be better than the man who destroyed you. Not for redemption, not to earn forgiveness. Just to know that I'm capable of growth instead of just repeating the same self-destructive patterns. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. That's more self-awareness than I expected. He tries. Edmund says people don't really change, that we just get better at hiding our true nature. Edmund's cynical. Is he wrong? Eleanor considered this. I don't know. I used to think people were fundamentally good or bad. That character was fixed, but these past weeks, she trailed off. I've learned I'm capable of hatred I didn't know existed inside me. Rage that scares me. If I can discover new capacity for darkness, maybe people can discover new capacity for light too. That's almost optimistic. Don't get used to it. But there was the ghost of a smile on her face, the first one Adrian had seen since the wedding. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, what they'd need to know about the estate, how to access the study, what to do if they were discovered. Eleanor knew the house better than Adrian, having visited countless times over the years. She could sketch the layout, identify which servants might be sympathetic, pinpoint when her father would be away at his gentleman's club. By the time Edmund returned a week later with detailed information from his disgruntled source, they had the skeleton of a workable plan. The actual execution would still be dangerous as hell, but at least it was possible. Edmund laid out the guard schedules and private study layout on Adrian's desk. The Marquis keeps his most sensitive documents in a locked cabinet behind a portrait of his grandfather. The cabinet has a key he wears on his watch chain, never takes it off. You'll need to pick the lock or find another way in. I can pick locks, Eleanor said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her. She shrugged. My brother taught me when we were children. He thought it was hilarious. Turns out it's actually useful. Edmund looked impressed despite himself. All right then. The harder problem is timing. The Marquis is in London for parliamentary sessions 3 days a week. But even when he's gone, the house has guards and servants. You'll need a distraction. What kind of distraction? Adrian asked. Something big enough to draw attention away from the study, but not so dramatic it brings law enforcement. Edmund thought for a moment. A fire in the kitchen? No, too dangerous. A medical emergency? Possible, but hard to fake convincingly. What about a scandal? Eleanor suggested. They looked at her. My cousin Beatrice is engaged to Lord Whitfield. Their relationship has been rocky. Lots of arguments, public disagreements. If someone were to suggest Beatrice was being seen with another man, it would cause absolute chaos in the household. My aunt would be hysterical. My father would have to intervene. Every servant would be gossiping instead of paying attention to what's happening elsewhere in the house. Edmund grinned. That's devious. I like it. How do we start that rumor without it being traced back to us? Adrian asked. Leave that to me, Edmund said. I know a few society gossips who'd spread scandal for free if it was juicy enough. Give me 2 days and Beatrice's reputation will be in flames. She'll hate us, Eleanor said. Probably, but this is war. There are casualties. Eleanor looked troubled but nodded. When? Edmund checked his notes. The Marquis will be in London for 3 consecutive days starting next Wednesday. That's our window. You'll need to travel to Ashford Estate Tuesday night. Stay with your aunt as a normal social visit and execute the theft Wednesday evening during dinner service when most staff are occupied. What if something goes wrong? Adrian asked. Then you improvise or you run. Those are your options. Edmund's expression was serious. But Adrian, if this fails, if you're caught, I can't protect you. Can't. The political capital required to save you from treason charges was enormous. There's nothing left for a second rescue. You understand that? I understand. And Eleanor, you're risking your relationship with your family permanently. Your father will see this as unforgivable betrayal. Eleanor's jaw tightened. He betrayed me first. He forced me into a marriage to protect his political investment. Whatever relationship we had died the moment he made me a bargaining chip. Fair enough. Edmund stood, gathering his papers. I'll set the Beatrice rumor in motion. You two start preparing. And for God's sake, try not to kill each other before Wednesday. I'd hate for this plan to fall apart because you couldn't maintain a temporary alliance. After Edmund left, Adrian and Eleanor stood in awkward silence. Finally, Eleanor said, We should practice. Practice what? Acting like a normal married couple. If we're going to be staying at my aunt's house, we need to convince people we've reconciled. Otherwise, it looks suspicious. Adrian's throat felt tight. How do we do that? Eleanor moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, lavender and something subtle underneath. Close enough to touch, if he wanted to. We pretend we don't hate each other. We remember what it felt like before everything fell apart. and we lie convincingly enough that nobody questions why we're there. She held out her hand. Adrian took it. Her fingers were warm in his, not the ice-cold touch of their wedding dance. Actual warmth, actual contact, actual human connection after weeks of careful distance. Like this, Eleanor said softly. We hold hands. We sit close together. We laugh at each other's jokes, even when they're not funny. We create the illusion of intimacy. Illusion, Adrian repeated. What else would it be? But her voice wavered slightly. We're not reconciled, Adrian. We're allies in a dangerous operation. That's all this is. Right, of course. But neither of them let go. They stood there in Adrian's study, hands linked, both pretending this was purely strategic while feeling the first crack in the walls they'd built between them. Not forgiveness, not love. Just the acknowledgement that somewhere underneath all the pain and betrayal, two people who'd once cared for each other might still have the capacity to be something other than enemies. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had an hour ago. And in the growing darkness of choices that couldn't be unmade and futures that couldn't be predicted, sometimes more was all you could hope for. Wednesday, Eleanor said finally, pulling her hand away. We leave Tuesday night. Wednesday, Adrian agreed. She left him alone in the study. Adrian stared at his hand where hers had been, feeling the ghost of her warmth, wondering if they were about to liberate themselves from the Marquis's control or simply exchange one cage for another. Either way, there was no turning back now. The wheels were in motion, and when you set a plan like this in motion, you either succeeded or you burned. Adrian had already burned once. He wasn't sure he could survive it happening again, but he was about to find out. Tuesday night arrived with the kind of cold that made your bones ache. Adrian and Eleanor traveled to the Ashford estate in separate carriages. Maintaining appearances even when no one was watching had become second nature after weeks of performance. The countryside rolled past in darkness, each mile bringing them closer to either liberation or destruction. Adrian kept his hands steady on his knees, forcing his breathing to stay even. This was it. The moment when he stopped being a victim of circumstances and started fighting back against the forces that had been controlling him since before he even knew he was trapped. People talked about courage like it was noble, like it was heroic. But real courage wasn't brave. It was desperate. It was the thing you did when every other option had been exhausted and the only choice left was between fighting or dying slowly in a cage. He'd already tried dying slowly. It wasn't working out. The Ashford estate loomed against the night sky like a monument to old power and older money. Adrian had been here dozens of times over the years. For dinners, for holidays, for the courtship that he now understood had been engineered from the first introduction. Every memory was poisoned now by the knowledge of manipulation beneath the surface. Every smile from the Marquis had been calculation. Every warm welcome had been strategy. Eleanor's carriage arrived 10 minutes after his. She stepped out looking perfectly composed in traveling clothes, her face a mask of polite warmth as her aunt rushed out to greet her. Lady Margaret was the Marquis's older sister, a widow who'd turned managing her brother's household into a full-time occupation. She pulled Eleanor into an embrace that looked genuine, then turned to Adrian with considerably less enthusiasm. "Your Grace," she said stiffly, "how unexpected to see you both here." Eleanor slipped her hand into Adrian's, the touch so natural it could have been real. "We wanted to visit family, Aunt Margaret. Things have been difficult since the wedding. We thought a change of scenery might help us reconnect." The lie was perfect. Just vulnerable enough to be believable, just hopeful enough to appeal to Margaret's romantic sensibilities. Adrian watched the older woman's expression soften fractionally. "Well," Margaret said, "I suppose that's admirable. Come inside before you catch your death. Your father is in London, Eleanor, but he'll return Friday." "Perfect," Eleanor said, squeezing Adrian's hand in a way that could have meant affection or could have meant the plan was proceeding exactly as they'd hoped. They were shown to separate bedrooms. Propriety still mattered even for married couples. And Adrian spent the next hour unpacking and trying not to think about the 100 ways this could go. Catastrophically wrong. Edmund's rumor about Beatrice should be circulating through London society by now, ready to explode tomorrow evening when they needed maximum distraction. The lockpicks were hidden in Eleanor's jewelry case. The guard schedules were memorized. The escape route was planned. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled, which meant everything that couldn't be controlled was about to become very important very quickly. Adrian lay awake most of the night, listening to the house settle around him, wondering if Eleanor was doing the same thing in her room down the hall, wondering if she was having second thoughts, wondering if the brief alliance they'd formed over the past week would hold under pressure or shatter the moment things got difficult. People always thought they were stronger than they actually were right up until the moment they got tested. Tomorrow would be the test, and Adrian had already failed too many tests to be confident about this one. Wednesday morning dawned gray and miserable. Adrian came down to breakfast to find Eleanor already there, chatting with her aunt about London fashions like she didn't have a care in the world. She glanced up when he entered, and something in her eyes told him the performance had already begun. "Good morning, darling," she said, the endearment sounding almost natural. Adrian bent and kissed her forehead, the gesture practiced from their rehearsals but feeling different now that they were actually executing the plan. Morning. They spent the day being the perfect reconciled couple, walking the grounds hand in hand, sitting close together in the drawing room, laughing at each other's comments with just the right amount of warmth. Lady Margaret watched them with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that her niece's marriage was healing. Adrian felt like he was playing a part in a theater production where the audience didn't know the stage was rigged to explode. Edmund's rumor arrived exactly on schedule at 4 in the afternoon. A messenger brought urgent news from London. Beatrice had been seen entering Lord Pemberton's townhouse alone, staying for over an hour, emerging disheveled and flushed. The scandal was already tearing through society. Lord Whitfield was demanding answers. The wedding might be called off. Lady Margaret went absolutely hysterical. Within minutes, the entire household was in chaos. Servants rushing to prepare carriages. Margaret screaming about family honor and reputation. Letters being frantically written and dispatched. The Ashford estate transformed from a place of quiet propriety into a tornado of aristocratic panic. Eleanor caught Adrian's eye across the drawing room. It was time. They slipped away during the worst of the chaos. Eleanor claiming she needed to lie down from the stress. Adrian saying he'd check on her. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even noticed. The household was too busy imploding to pay attention to two people walking calmly up the stairs. Eleanor's hand was shaking when she grabbed his arm. "This is it. Once we do this, there's no going back." "I know. If we're caught, we won't be. You can't promise that." "No," Adrian admitted. "But I can promise that whatever happens, we face it together instead of separately. That's better than what we had before." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She nodded once, sharp and decisive. They moved through the house like ghosts. Eleanor knew every hallway, every turn, every squeaking floorboard to avoid. The Marquis's private study was on the second floor, east wing, behind a door that was always locked when he wasn't in residence. Eleanor produced the lockpicks from inside her sleeve. Her hand steadied as she worked, muscle memory from childhood games taking over. The lock clicked open after 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Inside, the study was exactly as Edmund's source had described it. Heavy wooden desk, walls lined with books and maps. And behind the portrait of the previous Marquis, Eleanor's grandfather, a locked cabinet containing the most sensitive documents the current Marquis wanted to keep hidden. Adrian moved the portrait carefully. The cabinet was smaller than he'd expected, ornate ironwork with a keyhole that looked complex. Eleanor knelt beside it, examining the lock. "This is going to take time." "How much time?" 5 minutes. Maybe 10. Adrian positioned himself by the door, listening for footsteps. The chaos downstairs was still audible, Margaret's voice carrying through the house, servants rushing back and forth. Good. The distraction was holding. Eleanor worked in concentrated silence, her breathing steady, her fingers moving with precision. Adrian watched her and felt something twist in his chest. This version of Eleanor, focused, capable, willing to commit felony theft to escape her father's control, was magnificent in a way the dutiful daughter had never been. Suffering had revealed steel underneath her polished exterior. Maybe Edmund was wrong. Maybe people didn't just hide their true nature. Maybe trauma could actually forge something new instead of just exposing what was already there. "Got it," Eleanor breathed. The cabinet swung open. Inside were stacks of papers, legal documents, correspondence. Adrian and Eleanor began sorting through them quickly, looking for the debt papers that gave the Marquess his leverage. Most of it was standard aristocratic business, contracts, agreements, financial records. Then Eleanor pulled out a leather folder marked Blackthorne Estate Holdings. Her hands froze. What? Adrian asked. She opened the folder. Inside were the debt papers they'd come for. All of Adrian's father's gambling markers, carefully cataloged and preserved. But there was something else. A letter dated 15 years earlier, written in the Marquess's own hand. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice shaking. Lord Ashford to his solicitor. Continue acquiring Blackthorne debts as opportunities arise. The son shows promise. Military career, political connections, good bloodline. When the time comes, we will position Eleanor as the ideal match. A decade of preparation should be sufficient to ensure the arrangement appears natural rather than calculated. The Blackthorne title and estates, once secured through marriage, will complement our family's holdings perfectly. Adrian felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. 15 years. The Marquess had been planning this since Adrian was 17 years old, since before his father's death, since before he'd even met Eleanor. Their entire relationship had been a calculated acquisition from the very beginning. Eleanor's face had gone white. He was planning to use me as bait when I was a child, when I was still learning embroidery and French. He was already deciding my entire future. Adrian wanted to say something comforting, wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that they'd found what they came for and could leave. But his throat was too tight and his hands were shaking with rage that had nowhere to go. Take it all, he finally managed. Every document in that folder. We burn it tonight. Eleanor nodded, stuffing the papers inside her dress. Adrian checked the rest of the cabinet quickly, finding more correspondence that detailed just how thoroughly the Marquess had been manipulating events for over a decade. He took what looked important and left the rest. They were closing the cabinet when they heard footsteps in the hallway. Both of them froze. The footsteps stopped outside the study door. The handle turned. Adrian's mind raced. They were trapped. No other exits, no way to hide. If someone walked in right now, they were finished. The study door swung open. Lady Margaret stood in the doorway, her face a mask of confusion that rapidly transformed into shock and then cold fury. What are you doing in my brother's private study? For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady despite the papers hidden in her dress. Aunt Margaret, we can explain. You're stealing from him. Margaret's voice was ice. From your own father. He's been manipulating us, Eleanor said. Both of us. For years. We found proof. I don't care what you found. Margaret's composure shattered. How dare you betray family like this? After everything your father has done for you, after he saved your worthless husband from the gallows, this is how you repay him? Adrian saw Eleanor flinch at worthless husband, but she didn't back down. He forced me into this marriage to protect a political investment. I'm not his daughter. I'm a bargaining chip he spent 15 years positioning, you ungrateful child. Margaret moved toward them, her face twisted with rage. Your father gave you everything. Education, position, a chance at a brilliant match. And you throw it away for what? Some misguided sense of independence? For freedom, Eleanor shot back. For the right to make my own choices, instead of living out a script he wrote before I could even read. Margaret's hand whipped out, slapping Eleanor hard enough to snap her head sideways. The sound cracked through the study like a gunshot. Adrian moved without thinking. He stepped between Eleanor and her aunt, his voice dropping to something dangerous and cold. Touch her again, and I'll forget your family. Margaret laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. You'll forget I'm family? You're nothing but a debtor who should be grateful my brother allowed you to marry above your actual station. Your father died a penniless gambler. Your title is worthless without the Ashford money propping it up. You have no power here, boy. Something in Adrian snapped. All the weeks of humiliation, all the months of being controlled and manipulated and treated like a puppet, all the years of trying to live up to impossible standards set by a father who destroyed everything, in a society that valued titles over actual merit. It all came crashing down into a single moment of absolute clarity. He had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose were the most dangerous people alive. I may be a debtor, Adrian said quietly. I may be a fool who destroyed the best thing in his life. But I'm done being controlled by people who mistake money for actual power. We're leaving. And we're taking those documents with us. Margaret's eyes narrowed. If you walk out of this house with my brother's property, I will send for the constable immediately. You'll be arrested for theft. Both of you. Then send for the constable, Eleanor said, her voice steel. Tell them we stole proof of my father's decade-long conspiracy to manipulate a marriage for political gain. I'm sure society will be very interested in that story. Margaret hesitated. Adrian pressed the advantage. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to walk out of this study. We're going to leave this estate tonight. And you're going to tell your brother that we came for a visit and left early because of the Beatrice scandal. You'll say nothing about this conversation or what we took.
And why would I agree to that? Margaret demanded.
Because if you don't, Eleanor said coldly, I will make sure every detail of my father's manipulation becomes public knowledge. The debt accumulation, the arranged marriage, the way he's been treating his own daughter like property. Our family's reputation will be destroyed far more thoroughly by that scandal than by two people quietly leaving in the night. Margaret stared at them both, her face twisted with rage and indecision. Finally, she stepped aside. Get out, she hissed, both of you, and don't ever come back to this house. Eleanor moved toward the door, Adrian right behind her. They were almost out when Margaret spoke again, her voice poison. You think you've won something tonight, but all you've done is make powerful enemies. My brother will destroy you both for this betrayal. You'll wish you'd stayed in your comfortable cage. Adrian looked back at her. Maybe, but at least we'll be free when he comes for us. That's worth more than safety ever was. They walked out, made it down the hallway, down the stairs, past the chaos of servants still dealing with the Beatrice crisis, out the front door into the cold night air. Their carriage was waiting where they'd arranged it, Edmund's doing, prepared for a quick escape. They climbed inside and the driver took off immediately, horses moving fast through the darkness. Only when the Ashford estate disappeared behind them did Adrian let himself breathe. Eleanor sat across from him, shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline. Her hand touched her cheek, where Margaret had slapped her, fingers coming away clean but the mark still visible in the dim carriage light. Are you all right? Adrian asked. She laughed, the sound slightly unhinged. I just stole from my own father, got assaulted by my aunt, and committed what's probably several felonies. I'm spectacular. Eleanor, we did it. She looked at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been triumph. We actually did it. We walked into that house and took back control. Adrian pulled the documents from inside his coat, looking at them in the moonlight filtering through the window. 15 years of manipulation. Proof that their entire relationship had been engineered by a man who saw people as chess pieces instead of human beings. Part of him wanted to read every page, to understand exactly how thoroughly they'd been played. The rest of him just wanted to burn it all and never think about it again. What do we do now? He asked. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the carriage and took his hand. Not the practiced touch of their performance. Something real. Now we figure out who we actually are when we're not being controlled by him. We make our own choices, build our own life, probably make our own mistakes. She squeezed his fingers. But at least they'll be our mistakes instead of consequences of someone else's manipulation. Adrian squeezed back. That sounds terrifying. It does, doesn't it? They sat in silence as the carriage raced through the night, carrying them away from the Ashford estate and toward an uncertain future that was entirely their own for the first time in either of their lives. The document sat between them like a bomb waiting to detonate, because they both knew Margaret was right about one thing. The Marquis wouldn't let this go. He'd spent 15 years building this trap. He wouldn't accept having it dismantled by the two people he'd most expected to stay controlled. Retribution was coming. The only question was when and how brutal it would be. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, they'd won. And victory, however temporary, tasted like freedom. Ikis. They reached London by dawn, going straight to Adrian's townhouse. Edmund was waiting in the study with coffee and worry etched across his face. Tell me you got them, he said the moment they walked in. Eleanor pulled the documents from her dress, spreading them across the desk. Everything. The debt papers, the letter outlining the 15-year plan, correspondence about manipulating social situations to ensure we met. All of it. Edmund examined the papers, his expression growing darker with each page. Jesus Christ. He really did orchestrate the entire thing. This is monstrous, Adrian finished, calculating. Exactly what we expected, and somehow still worse seeing it written down. Eleanor moved to the fireplace, staring into the cold hearth. My own father. He mapped out my entire life before I was old enough to have opinions about what I wanted. Every introduction was staged. Every social event calculated. He turned me into bait without me even knowing I was being used. Adrian wanted to comfort her but didn't know how. They'd fought together, stolen together, escaped together. But comfort was a different kind of intimacy, one they hadn't earned back yet. Edmund poured 3 glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. So what's the play? We burn these, your leverage disappears, but so does his. You're free, but you're also completely exposed if he decides to retaliate. Can he retaliate? Eleanor asked. Without proof of the debts, he has no financial hold over Adrian, and we have enough information about his manipulation to create our own scandal if he tries anything public. He's a marquis with decades of political connections, Edmund pointed out. He doesn't need evidence to destroy people. He just needs influence and the will to use it. Adrian took his whiskey, thinking through scenarios. We need insurance, something that guarantees he won't come after us even if he wants to. Like what? Eleanor asked. Adrian looked at the documents spread across his desk. Like copies. We burn the originals in a very public way, prove we're not using them for blackmail. But we keep copies hidden with someone trustworthy, someone who will release them if anything happens to us. That's blackmail, Edmund said. No, Adrian corrected. Blackmail is using information to extract something. This is deterrence. We're not asking him for anything except to leave us alone. If he does, the information stays buried forever. If he doesn't, he gets destroyed by his own machinations, Eleanor finished. Her expression was thoughtful. That could work. But who do we trust to hold that kind of explosive information? Edmund raised his glass. I'll do it. I'm already complicit in this mess. Might as well go all the way. Adrian studied his friend. You'd risk your own reputation? What reputation? I'm a gambler and a drunk with questionable morals and excellent timing. Nobody expects nobility from me. Edmund grinned. Besides, this is the most interesting thing I've been involved in for years. I'm not missing the finale. Eleanor crossed to the desk, looking at the papers that represented 15 years of her father's control. We need to send him a message. Let him know we have the documents. We're destroying the originals, but copies exist as insurance. Make it clear this is over. He leaves us alone or everything becomes public. That's a declaration of war, Edmund warned. No, Adrian said slowly. War would be using this information to hurt him. This is a peace treaty. He gets to keep his reputation and political standing. We get our freedom. Everyone walks away intact as long as nobody violates the terms. You think he'll accept that? Eleanor asked. Adrian thought about the Marquis, the cold calculation in his eyes, the way he'd weaponized his own daughter without hesitation. A man like that didn't accept defeat easily, but he was also pragmatic. If the alternative was public humiliation and the destruction of everything he'd built, he might choose the option that let him save face. I think he's a survivor, Adrian said. And survivors know when to cut their losses. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then we do it. We send the message today. Burn the originals tonight. And we start building a life that's actually ours. Edmund started making copies of the most damaging documents. Adrian drafted a letter to the Marquis, carefully worded to make the terms absolutely clear without being inflammatory. Eleanor watched the process in silence, her face unreadable. When everything was ready, Adrian looked at both of them. Last chance to back out. Once we send this, there's no going back. Eleanor met his eyes. I stopped being able to go back the moment I picked that lock. This is the only direction left. She was right. They were committed now, all in. Edmund took the copies to hide in a location he refused to disclose, even to Adrian and Eleanor. The letter went out by courier with instructions to deliver it directly into the Marquis's hands. And the original document sat on Adrian's desk like a judgment waiting to be executed. That evening, they built a fire in the study hearth. Not for warmth, for ritual, for the symbolic destruction of everything that had controlled them. Adrian held up the first document, his father's gambling debt to a creditor who'd sold it to the Marquis 12 years earlier. The paper that had started the chain of leverage and manipulation. He dropped it into the flames. Eleanor added the letter outlining her father's 15-year plan, watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. One by one, they fed the fire. Every debt, every piece of correspondence, every shred of evidence that the Marquis had used to trap them both. The room filled with smoke and the smell of burning paper. When the last document caught fire, Eleanor spoke quietly. Do you think we're free now? Adrian watched the flames consume the final proof of their cage. I think we're as free as anyone ever gets, still carrying the past, still dealing with consequences. But at least we're choosing how we carry it instead of having it forced on us. That's not very reassuring. No, but it's honest. They stood together watching the fire burn down to embers, both of them knowing that somewhere in London the Marquis was receiving their message and deciding whether to accept peace or choose war. Either way, they'd made their choice. They'd chosen each other over safety, freedom over comfort, truth over the carefully constructed lies that had defined their entire relationship. It might destroy them, but at least it would be their destruction instead of someone else's design. Adrian felt Eleanor's hand slip into his, held it tight, and waited for the world to either accept their terms or come crashing down around them. The answer arrived 3 days later in the form of a letter with the Ashford seal, delivered by official courier to Adrian's townhouse door, and inside that envelope, the Marquis's response would determine whether they'd actually won their freedom or simply traded one cage for another. Even more dangerous, and the moment Adrian broke that seal and read the words written in his father-in-law's precise hand, everything they'd fought for would either be validated or destroyed, and Eleanor stood beside him as he opened it. Both of them knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together because that was the only choice they had left, and the only choice that actually mattered. The letter felt heavier than paper should. Adrian's hands didn't shake as he broke the Ashford seal, not because he was brave, but because fear had a way of crystallizing into something harder. When you'd already survived the worst thing you could imagine, he'd already lost everything that mattered, already destroyed the woman he loved, already committed treason and escaped hanging by selling himself into a prison disguised as marriage. What was one more consequence in a life built entirely from wreckage? Eleanor stood beside him near the window, morning light cutting across her face in ways that made her look older than her years. Battle did that to people. Not the kind fought with swords and cannons, but the kind fought in drawing rooms and bedrooms and the silent spaces between two people who used to love each other. She'd aged a decade in 3 months. So had he. Adrian unfolded the Marquess's response and read it aloud because they'd agreed no more secrets, no more manipulation, no more carefully controlled information. Whatever came next, they'd face it with eyes open. The letter was shorter than he expected. Your Grace and Eleanor, I have received your terms and reviewed the circumstances that led to this unfortunate situation. After considerable reflection, I accept your proposal with the following conditions. The original documents will be destroyed as stated. Copies will remain in neutral hands as insurance against future conflict. Neither party will speak publicly about the events that transpired or the arrangements that preceded them. In exchange, I will maintain necessary financial support for the Blackthorne estates through legitimate business partnerships that require no personal obligation. You will attend family functions as needed to maintain social appearances. Beyond these minimal requirements, you are free to live as you choose. I will not apologize for actions taken to protect my family's interests and secure my daughter's future. You may view my methods as manipulative. I view them as pragmatic. We will have to agree to disagree. However, I acknowledge that Eleanor deserves the right to choose her own path forward, even if I believe that path is dangerously naive. She is my daughter and I love her, though I suspect she no longer believes that. Perhaps in time she will understand that control and love are not mutually exclusive. They are simply different expressions of the same protective instinct. Do not mistake this acceptance for weakness. I am choosing peace because war would damage us all beyond repair. But make no mistake, if you violate these terms, if you use those documents for anything beyond insurance, I will unleash consequences that will make your previous troubles seem gentle by comparison. We have an accord. Let that be enough. Lord Ashford. Adrian finished reading and looked at Eleanor. Her face was unreadable, not blank, but complex in ways that suggested too many emotions fighting for dominance to let any single one win. He loves me, she said finally. Her voice was strange, distant, like she was testing the words to see if they still meant anything. He manipulated me for 15 years, used me as bait, forced me into a marriage to protect his investment. But he loves me. That's what he wants me to believe. Maybe he does, Adrian said carefully. People are capable of loving someone and still treating them terribly. Love doesn't automatically make your actions right. Eleanor laughed, the sound bitter and broken. You'd know about that, wouldn't you? The words were a knife between the ribs, precise and devastating. Adrian absorbed the hit because he'd earned it, because every accusation Eleanor made was just truth spoken aloud. Yes, he said quietly, I would. They stood in silence for a long moment. Outside, London was waking up, carriages rattling over cobblestones, merchants calling their wares, the endless noise of a city that didn't care about individual suffering because it had too much of its own to carry. The world kept turning, whether you were being destroyed or not. That was the thing about survival that nobody told you. Pain wasn't special. Tragedy wasn't unique. Everyone was fighting battles that would break them. And the universe didn't pause to acknowledge your particular version of falling apart.
So we won, Eleanor said. We got exactly what we wanted. Freedom from his control. The documents destroyed. An agreement that lets us live our own lives. She turned to face Adrian fully.
So why does it feel like we lost something anyway? Because freedom isn't the same as healing, Adrian said. We broke out of the cage, but we're still carrying the damage from being trapped in it. That doesn't just disappear because we're not being controlled anymore. Eleanor moved to the desk where the ashes of burned documents still sat in a bowl, gray and meaningless now, all that power reduced to nothing. She touched the ashes gently, almost reverently. I thought I'd feel different, lighter, like burning his leverage would somehow burn away everything he did to me. But I still feel... She stopped, her throat working. Adrian waited.
Hollow, Eleanor finally finished. I feel hollow. Like he didn't just manipulate my life. He took something essential out of me, and I don't know how to get it back.
Adrian understood that feeling intimately. He'd felt it since the night he'd walked away from her at Carlton House, chasing excitement and significance, and ending up with nothing but shame.
Hollowness wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the presence of absence, the space where something vital used to be before you destroyed it yourself or let someone else destroy it for you.
He crossed to where she stood, not touching but close enough to share the weight of the moment. What do we do now? Eleanor looked at him, really looked, the first time in months that her eyes held something other than emptiness or contempt.
I don't know. The honest answer is, I have no idea how to be married to you when our entire relationship was built on lies and manipulation. I don't know how to trust you after what you did. I don't know how to trust my own judgment after spending my whole life following a script my father wrote. She paused. But I know I don't want to keep living like we have been.
Strangers in the same house. Ghosts haunting each other.
What's the alternative?
We figure out who we actually are when we're not performing for anyone. She gestured at the space between them. No more pretending for society, no more maintaining appearances. Just two broken people trying to decide if they can build something real from the wreckage. That sounds terrifying.
It does, Eleanor agreed.
But we've already done the terrifying part. We stole from my father. We burned our only leverage. We forced a marquis to accept peace terms from people he considered beneath his notice. Figuring out how to talk to each other honestly seems manageable by comparison. Adrian wanted to believe that. Wanted to think that destruction could lead to reconstruction. That people who'd hurt each other this badly could still find their way to something resembling forgiveness. But he'd spent too many years watching men make promises about changing only to repeat the same destructive patterns the moment pressure returned. Edmund was right, he said. People don't really change. They just get better at managing their worst impulses. Eleanor considered this. Maybe. Or maybe change isn't about becoming a completely different person. Maybe it's about recognizing your damage and choosing not to let it control you. You can't erase what you did to me, Adrian. You can't undo the humiliation or the pain or the betrayal, but you can choose whether that defines everything you do going forward. And if I can't, if I'm fundamentally the same selfish bastard who destroyed you in the first place, then we end this marriage on our terms instead of my father's. Eleanor's voice was steady. I'm not staying trapped in another cage just because this one has different bars, but I'm willing to try if you are. Actually try. Not just go through the motions while resenting each other until we die. Adrian thought about the past 3 months. The silence. The distance. The crushing weight of living with someone who hated you while being legally bound to them forever. He thought about Eleanor crying behind locked doors and his own sleepless nights staring at ceilings and wondering how one person could destroy so much so quickly. But he also thought about the past week, working together to plan the theft. The moment her hand slipped into his in the carriage. The way she'd stood beside him when they burned the documents, both of them choosing freedom over safety. Maybe there was something salvageable in the ruins after all. I want to try, he said. Not because I deserve another chance. I don't. But because you deserve better than being married to someone who's already given up. If we're going to make this work, or end it, We should at least give it an honest attempt. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then we start over. Not pretending the past didn't happen, but not letting it be the only thing that defines us either. How do we do that? We talk. Actually talk. About things that matter instead of just maintaining polite distance. We figure out if there's anything left underneath all the damage. She met his eyes, and we accept that this might not work. The trying doesn't guarantee success. But at least we'll know we were honest instead of just scared. Adrian held out his hand. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Her fingers were warm, real. Not the performance they'd practiced or the cold tolerance of their wedding. Just two people touching because they chose to, not because anyone was forcing them. It wasn't love, but it was the first genuine moment they'd shared since everything fell apart. And maybe that was enough to build from. The weeks that followed were harder than Adrian expected. Honesty turned out to be brutal when you'd spent months avoiding it. They had conversations that ended in tears. Fights that exposed wounds neither knew how to heal. Moments of connection followed by days of careful distance when the weight of everything became too much to bear. But they kept trying. Adrian told Eleanor about Madrid. Not the sanitized version he'd shared before, but the real one. The fear. The moments of cowardice he'd hidden behind medals and commendations. The soldier he'd watched die because Adrian gave the wrong order and spent years pretending it didn't haunt him. Eleanor told him about growing up as the Marquis's daughter, the constant pressure to be perfect, the way her father's approval always came with conditions. The years of learning that love was something you earned through obedience rather than received freely. She cried when she admitted that part of her had been relieved when Adrian ended their engagement because it meant escaping a future of being the perfect duchess for a man who would never actually see her. They learned things about each other that engagement had never revealed. Eleanor was brilliant with numbers, could calculate complex equations in her head, and had opinions about economic policy that were sharper than most lords in Parliament. Adrian discovered he liked working with his hands, spent hours in the estate workshop repairing things that had been broken for years, finding something meditative in the act of fixing what could actually be fixed. Slowly, carefully, they built something that resembled friendship. It wasn't romance. The trust was too fractured for that, but it was honest in ways their original courtship had never been. They knew each other's damage now, knew exactly how much harm they were capable of inflicting, and chose to be careful with that knowledge instead of weaponizing it. Edmund visited regularly, his cynicism a useful counterweight to their tentative optimism. He watched them navigate their strange new dynamic with something that might have been approval or might have been concern. You two are either going to figure out something beautiful or destroy each other completely, he said one evening over drinks. I genuinely can't tell which. Can it be both? Eleanor asked. Edmund laughed. That's the most honest thing I've heard all week. 3 months after burning the documents, Adrian woke up to find Eleanor sitting at his desk, reading through old letters they'd written during their engagement. She'd been crying. He could tell from her red eyes and the way she held herself. He should have left her alone. Should have given her privacy to process whatever emotions those letters brought up. Instead, he sat down across from her. Eleanor looked up, not bothering to hide her tears. I was so happy. Reading these, I can see how completely in love with you I was. How I believed we were building something real. We were, Adrian said quietly. My feelings were real. I just didn't know how to value them properly until I'd already destroyed them. Eleanor set the letters down. The woman who wrote these doesn't exist anymore. You killed her that night at Carlton House. The person I am now, I don't even know if she's capable of loving you the way I did before. I know. So where does that leave us? Adrian thought about it. Honestly thought instead of just reacting. I think it leaves us with a choice. We can mourn who we used to be and what we lost. We can let that grief define everything. Or we can accept that those people are gone and figure out who we are now. Maybe the woman you are now and the man I'm trying to become can build something different. Not better or worse than what we lost, just different. Eleanor wiped her eyes. You really think that's possible? After everything? I think people survive impossible things all the time. Soldiers who lose limbs learn to walk again. Widows who lose husbands learn to live again. The grief doesn't disappear, but they build lives around it. We could do that. Build a life around the grief of who we used to be while becoming whoever we're supposed to be next. That's very philosophical for someone who used to think deep thoughts were boring. I've had a lot of time to think lately. Turns out suffering makes you philosophical whether you want to be or not. Eleanor almost smiled. It would have been the first real smile he'd seen from her in months. Almost didn't count, but it was closer than they'd gotten before. "I want to show you something," she said. She led him to a room on the third floor that had been locked since they moved to Blackthorne Hall. Inside was a piano, dusty from neglect, but still beautiful. Eleanor sat at the bench and began to play. Adrian didn't recognize the piece, but it was haunting, melancholic without being maudlin, the kind of music that acknowledged pain without drowning in it. When she finished, Eleanor's hands rested on the keys. "I used to play for hours when I was younger. My father hated it, said it was a waste of time better spent on useful accomplishments. So I stopped. Just gave up something I loved because someone else decided it had no value." "Why are you playing now?" "Because I'm tired of letting other people's opinions determine what I'm allowed to enjoy." She looked at him. "You asked what we do now. This is what I do. I reclaim pieces of myself that got buried under expectations and manipulation. I remember who I was before everyone told me who I should be." Adrian sat beside her on the bench. "Teach me." "What?" "Teach me to play. I have no musical talent whatsoever. I'll probably be terrible, but you love it, and I want to understand the things that matter to you, even if I'm bad at them." Eleanor stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Then, slowly, she positioned his fingers on the keys and began teaching him the simplest possible melody. He was terrible, absolutely atrocious, hit wrong notes, lost rhythm, made sounds that could generously be called music only if you had no appreciation for actual music. Eleanor laughed. Not a polite social laugh or a bitter cynical laugh. A real one. The sound of genuine amusement at his complete incompetence. Adrian hit another wrong note deliberately just to hear her laugh again. She did, and in that moment, surrounded by dusty furniture in a forgotten room, making terrible sounds on an old piano, both of them damaged and broken and trying anyway, Adrian felt something shift, not healing, not forgiveness. But the first faint possibility that healing and forgiveness might be achievable somewhere down the road if they kept choosing each other instead of their damage. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had yesterday. And maybe accumulation of small moments was how you rebuilt a life after burning the old one to ash. 6 months after the Ashford confrontation, Adrian received an invitation to Lord Pemberton's annual hunting party. The kind of social event he'd once attended without thought, back when his reputation was intact and scandal was something that happened to other people. He showed the invitation to Eleanor over breakfast. She looked at it for a long moment. "Are you going?" "I don't know. Probably not. Most of society still thinks I'm either a traitor or an idiot, or both. Showing up just invites speculation and gossip. Or it shows them you're not hiding, that you're not ashamed of the choices you made." Eleanor set down her tea. "I think we should go." "We?" "Together. As an actual couple instead of two people pretending to tolerate each other. Let society see that we're making this work on our own terms." Adrian studied her face, looking for signs this was performance or obligation. Found neither. Just determination and something that might have been the beginning of pride. "You want to face down the entire ton together? After everything they've said about us? Why not? They're going to talk regardless. Might as well give them something interesting to say." She smiled, a real one this time, with actual warmth behind it. "Besides, I'm tired of hiding like we did something wrong. Yes, you made terrible choices. Yes, my father manipulated us both. But we faced that. We fought back. We earned our freedom. That's worth showing off." Adrian felt something warm expand in his chest. Not quite pride. Not quite hope. Something between the two that felt dangerously close to actual partnership. "All right," he said. "We go together." The hunting party was exactly as awkward as expected. Whispers followed them everywhere. Lords who used to seek Adrian's company suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Ladies who'd once courted Eleanor's friendship turned cold shoulders and cutting remarks. But Adrian and Eleanor faced it together. When Lady Ashford made a pointed comment about hasty marriages and regretted choices, Eleanor responded with cutting politeness that left the older woman sputtering. When Lord Whitfield suggested Adrian's military service was perhaps exaggerated given his personal failings, Adrian smiled and agreed that personal failings were indeed his area of expertise, which was why he recognized Whitfield's from across the room. They weren't winning popularity contests, but they weren't cowering either. Edmund found them during the actual hunt, All three of them terrible shots, making terrible attempts at bagging game while the serious hunters ranged farther into the estate. "You two are either very brave or very stupid," Edmund observed. "Possibly both." "Definitely both," Eleanor said. "But we're doing it together, which makes it slightly less stupid. Does it, though?" Edmund grinned. "I'm not convinced joint stupidity is better than solo stupidity. It's just stupidity with company." "Everything's better with company," Adrian said, surprised to find he meant it. They returned to London that evening exhausted but oddly triumphant. They'd survived social warfare without either retreating or destroying each other. Small victory, but victories counted regardless of size. Eleanor fell asleep in the carriage on the way home, her head dropping onto Adrian's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't want to wake her, just sat there feeling the weight of her trust, fragile and tentative but real, and understanding that this was what actual intimacy felt like. Not passion or excitement, just comfort. Safety. The knowledge that someone had seen you at your absolute worst and chosen to stay anyway. When they arrived at Blackthorne Hall, Adrian woke her gently. She blinked up at him, disoriented and vulnerable in that space between sleep and waking. "We're home," he said. Eleanor nodded, then did something unexpected. She kissed his cheek, quick and chaste and completely spontaneous. Then she was out of the carriage and heading inside before Adrian could process what happened. He sat in the empty carriage, touching his cheek where her lips had been, feeling like he'd just been given something infinitely precious that he had no idea how to protect. Inside, Eleanor was already heading upstairs to her bedroom, still separate from his, still maintaining physical boundaries they weren't ready to cross. But she paused on the landing and looked back. "Thank you," she said, "for today. For standing beside me instead of behind me or in front of me, just beside. Always," Adrian said, and meant it with everything he had. Eleanor smiled and disappeared into her room. Adrian stood in the empty hallway, understanding that love wasn't what he'd thought it was. It wasn't grand gestures or passionate declarations. It wasn't excitement or conquest or validation. It was this: showing up, standing beside someone even when it was hard, choosing them over and over again in 1,000 small moments that nobody else would ever see or appreciate. He'd spent years chasing the wrong definition, but maybe it wasn't too late to learn the right one. Again. A year after burning the documents, Adrian and Eleanor hosted their first dinner party at Blackthorne Hall. Small affair, just Edmund and a few carefully selected couples who'd proven themselves capable of seeing past scandal to the actual people underneath. Eleanor had transformed the dining room through subtle changes that made it feel warm instead of formal. Candles instead of harsh lamplight, flowers from the estate gardens instead of expensive imported arrangements, food that was excellent but not ostentatious. She'd become remarkable at creating spaces that felt genuine instead of performative. Adrian watched her navigate conversations with grace and intelligence, drawing out quieter guests while gently managing more domineering ones. This was Eleanor unfiltered by her father's control or society's expectations, just herself. Brilliant and kind and stronger than anyone gave her credit for. During dessert, Lord Hartley, Edmund's cousin and one of the few aristocrats who'd stayed loyal, raised his glass. "To our hosts, for proving that the most interesting stories aren't about avoiding mistakes, but about how we handle them after they've been made." Everyone drank. Adrian caught Eleanor's eye across the table. She was smiling, and this time it reached her eyes. Real happiness. Not performance. Not pretense. Just genuine contentment with the life they were building from ruins. After the guests left, they stood together in the empty dining room, surveying the wreckage of a successful evening. "That went well," Eleanor said. "It did. People might actually stop thinking we're a scandal waiting to implode." "We are a scandal," Adrian pointed out. "We'll always be the couple who broke engagement, committed theft, and blackmailed a marquess. That doesn't just disappear." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But maybe we can be other things too. The couple who hosts lovely dinners, who supports each other, who figured out how to build something real after everything fell apart." She moved closer, and Adrian felt his heart rate spike. They'd been dancing around physical intimacy for months. Small touches, brief contacts, moments that suggested possibility without demanding commitment. But this felt different, more intentional. Eleanor reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To try."
Actually try being married to you instead of just coexisting in the same house.
She met his eyes directly. I'm not saying I've forgiven everything. I'm not saying we're back to how things were before. But I'm saying I want to see if we can build something new. If you want that too. Adrian's throat felt tight, more than anything. Then take me upstairs. Not to separate bedrooms, to ours. Adrian took her hand. They climbed the stairs together, both nervous and uncertain and willing to be vulnerable despite every reason not to be. When they reached the landing, Eleanor paused. If this doesn't work, if we try and it's too broken to fix, we'll be honest about it. No more performing, no more pretending. We'll end it with dignity and move forward separately. Agreed? Agreed. She squeezed his hand. Then let's find out. What happened next was private. Sacred. The kind of intimacy that didn't need narration or witnesses. Two people who'd hurt each other learning how to be gentle again. Discovering that broken things could still hold beauty if you were careful with the pieces. Afterward, they lay in darkness talking about nothing and everything. Plans for the estate. Ideas for Eleanor's music room. Whether they wanted children or needed more time. The conversation meandered and circled, comfortable in its lack of destination. Eventually, Eleanor fell asleep curled against Adrian's side, her breathing slow and steady. Adrian stayed awake longer, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the past year. Everything he'd destroyed and everything they'd rebuilt. The person he'd been versus the person he was becoming. The difference between performance and authenticity, between control and genuine connection. He thought about his father, the gambler who died leaving nothing but debt and disappointment. About the Marquis who'd spent 15 years orchestrating manipulation disguised as care. About all the ways powerful men convinced themselves that control was the same as strength. Real strength, Adrian was learning, wasn't about controlling outcomes or dominating circumstances. It was about facing damage honestly and choosing to grow instead of repeating patterns. It was about standing beside someone as an equal instead of trying to possess them. It was about understanding that love wasn't ownership or validation, but the daily choice to show up and try even when it was hard. His father had never learned that. The Marquis never would. But maybe Adrian could. Maybe that was how you broke cycles of destruction. One conscious choice at a time, one day at a time, accepting that growth was slow and unglamorous and required humility instead of pride. Eleanor stirred in her sleep, unconsciously moving closer. Adrian put his arm around her and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Society wouldn't forget their scandal. The Marquis would continue being manipulative from a distance. Life would be complicated and messy and full of opportunities to fail again. But tonight they'd chosen each other freely, without coercion or control. Just two broken people deciding that broken didn't mean worthless and damage didn't mean defeated. And sometimes when you'd lost everything and been forced to rebuild from nothing, that was the most powerful thing you could claim. Not perfection, not redemption. Just the honest acknowledgement that you'd survived your own worst impulses and were still trying to be better. It wasn't the ending Adrian had imagined when he was young and arrogant and convinced the world existed to validate his importance. But it was real. And real, he was learning, was worth more than every fantasy he'd ever chased. Outside, London settled into its nighttime rhythms. Inside Blackthorne Hall, two people slept in each other's arms, their future uncertain, but finally, completely their own. And in the morning, when they woke up, they'd choose each other again, and again, and again, for as long as that choice remained worth making. Because that's what love actually was. Not the fireworks or the drama or the grand gestures that made great stories. Just the quiet, unglamorous decision to keep showing up, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. And they would keep showing up, together,